At the very bottom, it says, what supports the tradition of this location being the place of Jesus' sermon? This article is going to put forth some evidence for why some people believe that this location that we're going to read about is where Jesus gave his sermon on the Mount, okay? Or the Sermon on the Plain, all right? Just his sermon in general. So the first question we're going to look for here in the article is what things appear in the article that support this actually being the place. And then question number 2 is what counters the tradition of this location being the place. There are some people who question whether this actually is where Jesus gave his sermon. Okay? All right, so we're going to go ahead and read through the article, and then as we do, we'll discuss it, but you should be able to write down at the bottom things that either support it being the location or things that don't. Okay? And I've got some pictures up here that show this location, which is referred to as the Mount of the Beatitudes. All right, would someone please go ahead and read for us the very first paragraph that says the Mount of the Beatitudes. Lizzie, you can start us off.
The Mount of the Beatitudes refers to the place, according to tradition, where Jesus delivered the Sermon on the Mount. Located on a large hill in northern Israel, it is walking distance from Nazareth and overlooks the Sea of Galilee near Capernaum.
Near Capernaum. Okay, very good. All right, so this place called the Mount of the Beatitudes does refer to where some people believe Jesus gave his Sermon on the Mount. Now, in that first paragraph, we already have some pieces of evidence that are provided that would make one think that perhaps this is where Jesus gave his sermon. Could someone give us something from just the first paragraph that would support this position? See, AJ?
Walking distance from Nazareth.
Okay, so its location, people always talk about location, location, location. Well, the location of this mount is actually in a very logical location. It is a walking place that's a walking distance from Nazareth. Now, why would that be significant? Well, Nazareth is where Jesus spent much of his early life, okay? So this was located close to where he lived. It also overlooks the Sea of Galilee near Capernaum. And if you remember, we talked about, I know this is last year, but we had talked about how, remember, when Jesus began his ministry, he actually left Nazareth and moved to Capernaum, okay, when he started his ministry. So not only is this location not far from where he spent his first 30 years of his life, it's also pretty close to Capernaum, where he lived during his actual ministry. So if you're wondering where would Jesus have given his sermon, you would think, well, probably somewhere close to where he lived. So the location would seem to support that, okay? But the argument isn't over yet, okay? Would someone read the next paragraph where it says the actual location of Jesus' sermon? Cameron, go ahead and read there for us.
The actual location of Jesus' sermon is not known, but the commission of this site as the place goes back to the time of the Crusades. Supporters of this tradition point to the prominence of the Roman feature of the area, as well as its broad low hills, which confirm also to the expression of the sermon being given on the mountain.
Okay, so it does point out that we don't know exactly where Jesus gave his sermon, all right? But for those people who believe this might be, there's some other things that, piece of evidence that would support it. So in the second paragraph, what's something else that supports the tradition? This is what Cameron just read. See, Ryan? Okay, so the tradition, the stories that have been handed down by some people go back all the way to the time of the Crusades. All right, so people back to the time of the Crusades have said this is where Jesus gave his sermon. And if you know, the Crusades were fought back in the 11th and 12th century, almost 1,000 years ago. That's a pretty old tradition, okay? It also mentions that when you look at the area, the geography of it does seem to kind of conform both to Matthew's version and Luke's version. Because remember, Matthew says Jesus was up on a mountain, and Luke says he was on a plain. Okay? Well, if you look, and I tried to give you a good picture there in the article, but if you look, you can see that it is a big hill. So if you're a Matthew fan and you think, hey, Jesus was definitely up on a high area of land, well, it is a hill, so he could have done that. But then if you look, there's kind of like some low areas as well, okay? I mean, it's not like, Mount Olympus, okay? It's not like a huge, really steep place. It has some gradual sloping areas. So someone could say, well, maybe Jesus would have given his sermon there, okay? So it does kind of help both versions. Now, let's go back to the one that Ryan pointed out. I would argue not only the fact that the story does go back a long way, that could be something that could be used as a supporting evidence. I also think one could argue it to being against this being the actual location. Can someone try to pick up what I'm trying to lay down here?
Yeah.
I think the fact that the stories go back to the time of the Crusades could be used as supporting evidence, but it also could be used to refute it. Anyone see what I'm trying to say here? See, Anna? Okay, well, here's the problem. All right, the Crusades happened back in the 11th century, okay, or 12th century. That's almost 1,000 years ago. When did Jesus give his sermon? 2,000 years ago. So even though people have been telling this story going back 1,000 years, they haven't been telling the story going back 2,000 years. So why weren't people saying this was the spot before the Crusades? Okay? What about the 1,000 years from Jesus' time to the Crusades? How come people weren't calling it that? It almost kind of makes you wonder that maybe there were some European knights that went on a crusade and went to the Holy Land, and when they came and they survived them and they came back home, they're like, oh yeah, it was awesome. We were in the Holy Land. We were in all these places where Jesus did all these things. We climbed this one hill, and I swear I bet that's where Jesus gave his Sermon on the Mount. And then suddenly they tell that story, and then it gets handed on. And before you know it, everyone's like, oh yeah, this is the place where Jesus gave his sermon. Even though no one before that, and again, we're going to read further here, maybe no one before that ever said, yes, this is where it happened. So I would say that is a supporting piece of evidence, but it also could be used to refute it. How come people haven't always said that? Okay? All right, let's go on to the third paragraph here. Skeptics, what's a skeptic? Yeah, someone who's like, I'm not sure about this. So here's the other side of the argument, okay? Skeptics of this tradition counter with the fact that centuries prior to the tradition, St. Jerome, hopefully you remember him from last year, known for his knowledge of the Holy Land, had wrote that the sermon would likely have been given on nearby Mount Tabor instead. Also, few other supporting references exist from the early church. So here is where people would say, I don't know, I don't think this was the place. Okay, so let's start with St. Jerome. What does it say about St. Jerome? What does it say about St. Jerome? He knew a lot about the Holy Land. If you remember last year when you guys were doing your little skits, remember he spent a lot of time in the Holy Land, out in the desert by himself. Okay, there was even a story where he thought that one of the places where he was at was the actual location where Jesus had been born. So he seemed to kind of know, or at least we think he knew, a lot about the Holy Land. And he said in his writings that he thought that it was somewhere else. Mount Tabor, yeah, being the place where it was. And it's like, I don't know if you remember, St. Augustine once said, if St. Jerome doesn't know it, nobody knows it and never did, okay, or ever did. So it's like if you take Jerome as being a pretty logical person, and he did live closer to the time of Jesus, okay? Remember, he lived about 300-400 years after that. He didn't think it was, okay? So if you're a Jerome fan, you'd be like, well, if Jerome says it's not the spot, then it's probably not. The other thing is that there really just are not many other sources that support this, okay? There's just not a lot of people who, in their writings, over the course of the centuries, that have said, yeah, this is the spot. Now, just because there aren't many sources doesn't mean that something can't be true. But as a historian, trying to approach it objectively, you'd have to say, well, it's questionable. Okay? All right. Last paragraph here. Now, whether this is the place or whether it's not, it is still revered as a holy landmark. In fact, it says here, a Byzantine church was built on this site in the 4th century AD, okay, and was used until the 7th century, all right? So, when Christianity started to become the official religion of the Roman Empire, they started building churches. And they built one on this site. Okay? There also today are the remains of a medieval monastery. And it says in the 1930s, a Catholic Franciscan chapel was built, which still stands today as a prominent pilgrimage site. And there's a good photograph of what it looks like. This is the chapel. It's operated by the Franciscans. Okay, and you can see it's a really beautiful place, beautiful location, overlooking the Sea of Galilee there. Okay, there's the picture that you have looking up the hill there. They even have like a monument there that says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." So basically, the people that operate this today, you know what they tell people? They tell people this is the place. Okay, not trying to mislead people, but saying, we think this is where Jesus gave his Sermon on the Mount. In fact, in the year 2000, John Paul II made a visit to the Holy Land and celebrated Mass at the chapel. And I can't remember the transcript of what he said, but I'm sure that he probably was in this very area. Our Lord, delivered his sermon and taught the Beatitudes. Okay, so again, I'm not trying to tell you that this is where Jesus gave his sermon. We'll never know for sure, but there's a lot of places in the Holy Land that are kind of like this. We think this is where this happened. We think this is where the patriarch was buried. We think this is where Jesus did this or did that. It's kind of way that the Holy Land is. But again, he gave his sermon somewhere. All right, maybe it was on that hill, maybe it was on Mount Tabor. We don't know for sure, but Jesus definitely did give his sermon. Okay, so at the bottom of your paper, did you write down the things we were talking about?
Yes.
Okay, make sure you do, because this is one of our sections of our unit. You want to be able to say, here's why people think that it might be the place. Here are some reasons why people maybe question it. Okay? All right, so that is the Mount of Beatitudes.